This wasn't just a mistake. It wasn't one bad report or a single wrong opinion that slipped through the cracks and got forgotten a week later. What happened in Cleveland last season felt far more deliberate than that. Because when the same narrative is repeated over and over again, with confidence, authority, and consistency, despite growing evidence that it might not be true, you have to start questioning whether it was ever about being right in the first place. At some point, it stops looking like analysis and starts looking like control. Fans were given a very clear story from the beginning. They were told who was ahead in the quarterback room, who understood the system better, and who the organization truly believed in moving forward. And the message didn't come from random voices. It came from someone with access, someone plugged into the building, someone whose job was to inform the public. Naturally, people trusted it. That's how this works. When an insider speaks with that level of certainty, fans assume there's truth behind it that they simply can't see. But underneath that polished narrative, something didn't sit right. There were small details, almost easy to overlook at first, that didn't fully align with the bigger story being told. Quiet admissions buried within reports, subtle acknowledgments that hinted at a completely different reality. The kind of details that don't make headlines but start to add up if you're paying attention. And the more those contradictions appeared, the harder it became to ignore the possibility that what fans were hearing wasn't the full picture. That's when everything shifts, because now, instead of asking whether the reporting was accurate, you start asking why it sounded the way it did, why certain players were consistently elevated while others were held back even when performance suggested otherwise, why the tone remained so steady even as the situation on the field began to challenge it. And once you begin looking at it through that lens, it opens up a much bigger conversation, one about influence, access, and how narratives can be shaped behind the scenes. Now that the season is over and the outcomes are clear, those earlier reports look very different in hindsight. The timeline tells a story that isn't just about quarterbacks competing for a job, it's about how information flows, who controls it, and what happens when the version presented to the public doesn't quite match what's actually unfolding. And once you start connecting those dots, it becomes obvious that this wasn't just something that got reported wrong, it was something that may have been guided all along. To understand how this whole situation unfolded, you have to go back to the very beginning, before the games, before the controversy, before anyone really questioned what they were being told. The Cleveland Browns entered the season with what looked like a straightforward quarterback setup on the surface. Joe Flacco was the veteran presence, the expected starter, the steady hand meant to hold things together. Behind him were two rookies, Dillon Gabriel, a third-round pick with strong backing, and Shedeur Sanders, a fifth-round pick who came in with less draft capital but a growing buzz around his potential. That's where the real conversation started, not about who would start week 1, but who was truly next in line and who the organization truly believed in moving forward. And the message didn't come from random voices. It came from someone with access, someone plugged into the building, someone whose job was to inform the public. Naturally, people trusted it. That's how this works. When an insider speaks with that level of certainty, fans assume there's truth behind it that they simply can't see. But underneath that polished narrative, something didn't sit right. There were small details, almost easy to overlook at first, that didn't fully align with the bigger story being told. Quiet admissions buried within reports, subtle acknowledgments that hinted at a completely different reality. The kind of details that don't make headlines but start to add up if you're paying attention. And the more those contradictions appeared, the harder it became to ignore the possibility that what fans were hearing wasn't the full picture. That's when everything shifts, because now, instead of asking whether the reporting was accurate, you start asking why it sounded the way it did, why certain players were consistently elevated while others were held back even when performance suggested otherwise, why the tone remained so steady even as the situation on the field began to challenge it. And once you begin looking at it through that lens, it opens up a much bigger conversation, one about influence, access, and how narratives can be shaped behind the scenes. Now that the season is over and the outcomes are clear, those earlier reports look very different in hindsight. The timeline tells a story that isn't just about quarterbacks competing for a job, it's about how information flows, who controls it, and what happens when the version presented to the public doesn't quite match what's actually unfolding. And once you start connecting those dots, it becomes obvious that this wasn't just something that got reported wrong, it was something that may have been guided all along. To understand how this whole situation unfolded, you have to go back to the very beginning, before the games, before the controversy, before anyone really questioned what they were being told. The Cleveland Browns entered the season with what looked like a straightforward quarterback setup on the surface. Joe Flacco was the veteran presence, the expected starter, the steady hand meant to hold things together. Behind him were two rookies, Dillon Gabriel, a third-round pick with strong backing, and Shedeur Sanders, a fifth-round pick who came in with less draft capital but a growing buzz around his potential. That's where the real conversation started, not about who would start week 1, but who was truly next in line and who the organization truly believed in moving forward. And from the very first days of training camp, one version of that story took over completely. The message was clear, consistent, and repeated with confidence. Dillon Gabriel was ahead. He was more comfortable in the system, more prepared, more aligned with what the coaching staff wanted to do. If anything happened to Flacco, Gabriel would be the one stepping in. No hesitation, no debate. This wasn't framed as a possibility, it was presented like an established fact. Week after week, that same idea was reinforced, shaping how fans viewed the entire quarterback room before a single meaningful snap was played. What made it so powerful was the source. This wasn't just casual speculation or fan opinion, it was coming from someone deeply connected to the organization, someone whose words carried weight. When that kind of voice speaks with certainty, it doesn't just inform the audience, it guides them. Fans began to see Gabriel as the clear future, the logical next step, the quarterback the team was quietly building around. And at the same time, without ever being directly dismissed, Shedeur Sanders was positioned as the outsider looking in. Not ready yet, not quite there, still developing. But here's where it gets interesting, because narratives like this don't just reflect reality, they shape it. Once that idea takes hold, every practice report, every minor update, every quote from inside the building starts getting filtered through the same lens. Gabriel's progress was highlighted, emphasized, amplified. Sanders' development, even when mentioned, came with conditions, caveats, or reasons to wait. The gap between them didn't just exist, it was reinforced over and over again until it felt unquestionable. And that's how the foundation was set. Before the season even had a chance to reveal anything real, the story had already been written in the minds of the fanbase. One quarterback was ahead, one quarterback was the future, and one quarterback was still trying to catch up. But as the weeks went on, the reality on the field started telling a very different story. But this is where the story starts to crack, because while that narrative was being pushed with complete confidence, the actual details coming out alongside it told a very different story. Almost quietly, almost like it wasn't meant to be the headline, there were consistent acknowledgments that Shedeur Sanders was outperforming Dillon Gabriel in key areas that matter most for a quarterback. Not occasionally, consistently. Reports admitted that Sanders showed elite accuracy in camp, that in red zone situations where decisions have to be quick and throws have to be precise, he was the one winning those head-to-head reps more often than not. Think about that for a second. The same reporting that told fans Gabriel was clearly ahead was also admitting at the same time that Sanders was beating him in the exact situations that define quarterback play. That's not a small detail. That's not something you gloss over. That's the kind of information that should completely shift the conversation. And yet, it didn't. Instead, those details were treated like footnotes, mentioned, acknowledged, and then immediately overshadowed by the same conclusion. Gabriel is still ahead. Gabriel is still the guy. Gabriel is still next in line. No real explanation, no real breakdown of how those two ideas could exist at the same time. Just a continuation of the same storyline, as if the contradiction wasn't sitting right there in plain sight. That's where things start to feel off. Because when the evidence you're presenting doesn't match the conclusion you keep repeating, it raises a bigger question. Are you actually reporting what you're seeing, or are you reinforcing something that's already been decided? Because logically, it doesn't add up. If one quarterback is more accurate, winning key situational drills, and showing better control in high-pressure reps, how is he still viewed as behind? What exactly is he missing? And that question never really got answered.
Instead, what fans got was a steady stream of justification. Sanders is impressive, but he's not quite ready. Sanders is developing, but the offense would need to be simplified. Sanders is showing growth, but Gabriel understands the system better. It was always something. Always a reason to keep things exactly where they were, no matter what the performance suggested. And the more those justifications piled up, the more it started to feel like the evaluation wasn't actually changing. It was being protected. Because at some point, when you keep highlighting a player's strengths while simultaneously explaining why those strengths don't matter yet, it stops being analysis. It starts looking like narrative maintenance. And the deeper you look into it, the harder it becomes to ignore that something behind the scenes may have been shaping that narrative all along. And once you start pulling on that thread, the bigger picture inside Cleveland begins to come into focus. Because this wasn't happening in a vacuum. There were real dynamics at play behind the scenes, power dynamics, preferences, and decisions that had already been made long before the public ever caught on. At the center of it was Kevin Stefanski, a coach with a clear vision for what he wanted his offense to look like, and more importantly, who he wanted running it. From early on, it was widely believed that Stefanski had a strong preference for Dillon Gabriel. He pushed for him, believed in his fit within the system, and saw him as someone who could execute the structure of the offense the way it was designed. But here's where things get complicated, because while Stefanski had his guy, the front office made a different move. Andrew Berry used a later pick to bring in Shedeur Sanders, a player with a completely different profile, a different style, and arguably a higher ceiling. That created a subtle but very real tension inside the organization. On one side, you had a coaching staff invested in proving their evaluation right. On the other, a front office that had quietly introduced a competing option who didn't fit neatly into that original plan. Now think about how that plays out publicly. When there's internal disagreement, organizations rarely come out and say it directly. Instead, the messaging gets filtered, it gets shaped, and often it gets delivered through voices that the public already trusts. That's where the media comes in, because if a certain narrative benefits one side of that internal dynamic, it's not unusual for that version of events to be the one that gets emphasized externally. Not necessarily through outright falsehoods, but through selective framing, repeated talking points, and carefully positioned conclusions. And that's exactly what this started to look like. The consistent elevation of Gabriel wasn't just about performance, it aligned perfectly with what the coaching staff wanted to validate. At the same time, Sanders was being acknowledged just enough to maintain credibility, but never enough to seriously challenge the depth chart. Every positive note about him came with a limitation. Every sign of progress came with a reason to wait. It created a perception that felt balanced on the surface, but leaned heavily in one direction. That's what makes this so important, because when reporting begins to mirror internal preferences instead of independently evaluating what's happening, it stops serving the audience and starts serving the message. And in this case, the message was clear. Keep Gabriel in that number 2 spot, keep Sanders at a distance, and reinforce it often enough that nobody questions it. But narratives like that can only hold up for so long, because eventually the games start. And when they do, the field doesn't care about internal agendas, draft status, or who is supposed to be right. It reveals what actually is. And when that moment came, everything changed. And then the game started, and that's when the entire narrative ran into something it couldn't control anymore: reality. Because once Dillon Gabriel stepped onto the field as the primary backup and eventual starter, all the preseason confidence, all the reports about readiness and command of the system suddenly had to translate into actual production. And almost immediately, the gap between what fans were told and what they were seeing became impossible to ignore. The offense struggled to move the ball consistently through the air, drives stalled, big plays were almost non-existent. The same concerns that had been mentioned quietly before the draft, limitations in pushing the ball downfield, a tendency to check down under pressure, difficulty creating outside of structure, started showing up exactly the way critics feared they would. And it wasn't just an occasional issue, it became a pattern. Game after game, the ceiling of the offense felt capped, predictable, and at times completely stagnant. On paper, the numbers didn't look disastrous at first glance. A few touchdowns here, a manageable interception count there. It could be framed as developing or solid for a rookie, but context told a completely different story. The passing yards per game were low, the offense wasn't sustaining drives, the team kept finding itself in difficult situations because it simply couldn't generate enough through the air. And most importantly, nothing about this suggested this was a quarterback ready to take control of the future. Meanwhile, Shedeur Sanders was still watching from the sidelines. And that's what made it even more frustrating, because this wasn't a situation where there was no alternative. This wasn't a case of a team having no choice but to ride things out. There was another quarterback on the roster, one who had already shown flashes in practice, one who had reportedly outperformed in key areas, one who was consistently described as impressive in controlled settings. And yet, even as the offense struggled to find any rhythm, that option remained untouched. The disconnect kept growing. Fans could see it. Analysts started questioning it, but the narrative didn't fully break. Not yet. There were still explanations, still reasons to stay the course, still belief that things would eventually click. But each passing week made that harder to defend. Because at some point, development stops being an excuse and results start demanding attention. And then finally, something happened that no one could spin, no one could delay, and no one could control. The opportunity came, and this time, it couldn't be ignored. And then it finally happened, the moment that stripped away every layer of narrative and forced the truth into the open. It didn't come from a bold coaching decision or a planned shift in strategy. It came from something no one could control, an injury. When Dillon Gabriel went down, the door that had been kept shut all season suddenly swung wide open. And just like that, Shedeur Sanders was no longer a discussion point, he was on the field. From his very first start, the difference was undeniable. The offense looked alive in a way it simply hadn't before. There was rhythm, confidence, and most importantly, playmaking. Throws weren't just safe, they were decisive. Drives didn't just exist, they had purpose. You could feel it immediately. The same system that had looked limited and predictable suddenly had energy and flexibility. And it wasn't because the system changed, it was because the quarterback running it did.
Sanders stepped into a situation that wasn't built for him to succeed. The offensive line wasn't dominant, the receiving group wasn't consistently creating separation, and the team had spent months publicly signaling that he wasn't ready. Yet none of that showed up in how he played. He extended plays, he attacked windows, he created moments that simply hadn't existed before. It wasn't perfect, but it was real and it was impactful in a way that forced everyone watching to reconsider everything they thought they knew. And that's what made this moment so powerful, because it didn't just show that Sanders could play, it showed that he should have been playing much earlier. The flashes weren't random, the confidence wasn't surprising. It all looked like something that had been building behind the scenes, waiting for a chance that never came until it was forced. And once it did, it became impossible to argue that he belonged anywhere near the bottom of the depth chart. The results backed it up. Wins started to come. The offense found identity, and perhaps most telling of all, the conversation around the team began to shift, not slowly, but almost overnight. Suddenly, people weren't asking if Sanders was ready, they were asking why it took so long to find out. Because once the games told the truth, the narrative didn't stand a chance anymore. And just like that, the narrative didn't explode, it quietly disappeared. There was no big correction, no moment of accountability, no clear acknowledgement that what fans had been told for months no longer matched reality. Instead, the shift happened almost silently. The same voices that had confidently positioned Dillon Gabriel as the clear future suddenly began to soften, then pivot, then completely redirect the conversation without ever revisiting what had been said before. Now the tone was different. Shedeur Sanders was being described as the likely starter moving forward, the quarterback with momentum, the one the organization could build around. The confidence that once surrounded Gabriel didn't just fade, it was replaced. Almost overnight, he went from next in line to a question mark, from a developing cornerstone to a player whose role was suddenly uncertain. And what stood out the most wasn't the change itself, it was how effortlessly it happened. Because if you weren't paying close attention, you might not even notice it. There was no moment where someone stopped and said, "We got this wrong." No reflection on how the earlier reports had shaped expectations or influenced the fan base. No explanation for why the evaluations had shifted so dramatically in such a short amount of time. It was just different now. A new reality presented with the same confidence as the old one, as if the previous version had never existed. And that's where the idea of access starts to matter. Because when reporting relies heavily on relationships inside an organization, those relationships come with unspoken boundaries. You get information, but often through a specific lens. You stay close, but sometimes at the cost of complete independence. And when that balance tilts too far, reporting can slowly turn into something else, not outright false, but carefully framed, not incorrect in isolation, but misleading in the bigger picture. That's what this looked like. The earlier narrative aligned with what certain voices inside the building wanted to be true. The new narrative aligned with what could no longer be denied. And the transition between the two didn't come with transparency, it came with silence. A quiet reset that left fans to connect the dots on their own, without ever being told why the story they believed in for months had changed so completely. And now, heading into the next phase of this team's future, that silence matters more than ever, because the decisions being made today are built on what happened yesterday, even if no one wants to say it out loud. And now, as the offseason unfolds, the direction of this team doesn't feel uncertain anymore. It feels decided. Not officially announced, not stamped in bold headlines, but clear in the way decisions are being made, in the way language is being used, and in the way priorities are quietly shifting behind the scenes. Because if you look at how the Cleveland Browns are operating right now, it tells you everything you need to know about where this is going. The quarterback room, which once felt crowded with questions, is now narrowing into focus. Deshaun Watson remains part of the equation, but the real conversation is no longer about who might emerge, it's about how the competition between him and Shedeur Sanders will play out. That's where the attention is. That's where the investment is shifting. Sanders is no longer being framed as a developmental piece sitting in the background. He's being positioned as a legitimate contender for control of the offense moving forward. And then there's Dillon Gabriel. Not long ago, he was the centerpiece of the narrative, the quarterback the system was supposedly built to support. Now, the tone around him has completely changed. The language is careful, measured, almost distant. Phrases like "still has potential" and "bright future" are being used, the kind of language teams rely on when they're preparing to move on without creating unnecessary noise. Because this isn't about development anymore. This is about roster reality. The signs are all there. The Browns have made it clear they don't want another crowded quarterback competition dragging into training camp. They want clarity early. They want defined roles. And in that kind of structure, there simply isn't room for uncertainty sitting at the third spot. If another young quarterback is added through the draft, and all indications suggest that possibility is very real, Gabriel's position becomes even more fragile. At that point, the outcome feels less like a question and more like timing. Whether it's a trade, a late-round deal, or a quiet release, the organization appears to be positioning itself to move forward without him. Not in a dramatic way, not with headlines or statements, but in the same quiet, controlled way that this entire situation has unfolded. A slow shift, a subtle exit, and a new direction taking shape without ever needing to formally declare it. And while all of that is happening, something else becomes clear. The team is not just moving on from a player, they're moving towards a different identity. One that reflects what actually worked when the games were played, not what was expected before they began. But just as this story has been filled with tension, misdirection, and shifting narratives, there's another side to it. One that has nothing to do with depth charts or roster decisions, and everything to do with character. And that's where the focus turns next.
And just when the conversation felt completely consumed by depth charts, media narratives, and organizational politics, something happened that shifted the tone entirely. It wasn't about starting jobs or draft positioning. It wasn't about who was right or wrong. It was about perspective. Because while everything in Cleveland felt complicated, noisy, and at times frustrating, Shiloh Sanders gave everyone a reminder of what actually matters beyond all of that. When he returned to Jackson State University, it didn't feel like a publicity stop or a routine appearance. There was no sense of obligation in it. It felt genuine from the moment he stepped on campus. This was a place that shaped him, not just as a player, but as a person. And you could see that connection in everything he did. The way he interacted, the way he spoke, the way he carried himself. It was all rooted in something real. He didn't show up like someone chasing attention. He showed up like someone giving it. He spent time with students, not just talking at them, but actually connecting, sharing his experiences, being honest about the ups and downs, and making it clear that his journey wasn't defined by highlights alone. He spoke about the importance of education, about building something that lasts beyond the game, and about using the platform that comes with athletics in a meaningful way. It wasn't rehearsed, it wasn't filtered, it felt like someone speaking from experience, not from a script, and that's what made it stand out. Because in a world where so much attention is placed on performance, status, and constant comparison, Shiloh created a moment that had nothing to do with any of that. There were no stats involved, no rankings, no debates, just impact. Real impact, the kind that stays with people long after the moment is over. Students walked away from that interaction feeling seen, motivated, and valued, not because of who he is on a roster, but because of who he chose to be in that moment. It also reinforced something that often gets overlooked. For all the noise surrounding the Sanders name, for all the headlines and expectations, there's a consistency in how they carry themselves. Not perfect, not without challenges, but grounded in something deeper than just football. And Shiloh, in that moment, embodied that completely. He wasn't there as a headline, he was there as an example. And in contrast to everything happening in Cleveland, the shifting narratives, the quiet pivots, and the unanswered questions, this felt refreshingly simple. No agenda, no spin, just authenticity. And sometimes that says more than any performance ever could. And when you step back and look at everything that unfolded, it becomes clear that this was never just about who should start at quarterback. It was never just about Dillon Gabriel versus Shedeur Sanders, or about wins, losses, and stat lines. This was about something much bigger: how narratives are built, who controls them, and what happens when the version of the story being told doesn't match what's actually happening on the field. Because for months, fans were asked to believe in a version of reality that in hindsight didn't hold up. They were told who was ready and who wasn't. They were guided toward a conclusion that felt certain at the time, but ended up being completely flipped once real games forced the truth into the spotlight. And that kind of shift doesn't just happen randomly. It reveals how much influence exists behind the scenes, shaping perception before results ever have a chance to speak. At the same time, it also exposed something else, something that often gets lost in all the noise. Through all the narratives, all the shifting opinions, and all the quiet pivots, the way the Sanders family carried themselves never really changed. Whether it was Shedeur Sanders stepping in and proving he belonged the moment he got the opportunity, or Shiloh Sanders showing what leadership and character looked like away from the field, there was a consistency there that stood in contrast to everything else. And that's what makes this story stick. Because long after the depth charts are updated, long after roster moves are finalized, and long after the debates fade out, what people will remember isn't just who started or who got benched. They'll remember how the story was told and how different it looked once the truth finally had its moment. So now, the question shifts to you. Did you see through it while it was happening, or did the narrative do exactly what it was designed to do? Because one thing is certain, once you've seen how this plays out, you don't look at these stories the same way again.